Chronic wasting disease is important because it has the potential to kill off many of the native species of deer in America, and it also has the potential to infect humans. Ronald Oswalt, who has a master's in law from the University of Denver, describes the disease as an infectious, fatal neurological disease affecting at least 3 species within the deer family. Ermias Bailey is an associate director for epidemiological science at Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He and his associates describe the disease as a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy or prion disease. Bailey also mentions that chronic wasting disease was first discovered in Colorado in the late 1960s. Chronic wasting disease was generally considered a low-threat disease in cervids in the late 1990s, cervids being mammals of the deer family. Surveillance during this time was low, and many cervids were transported around North America, spreading the disease. It was not until the early 2000s that awareness for the disease started to spike. Many states responded rapidly to the increasing threat. What is a prion disease? How dangerous is chronic wasting disease? What is the correct response to the increasing prevalence of this disease? And is the disease being addressed properly by North America? The answer to those questions is prion diseases are dangerous, lethal diseases that are hard to manage, but North America is putting in good effort to respond. What is a prion disease? Chronic wasting disease is a form of prion disease. Some other common prion diseases include scrapie in goats and sheep, bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle, also known as mad cow disease, and Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease in humans. Oswalt describes prion diseases as an infection that converts prion proteins found in the central nervous system to abnormal, misfolded prion proteins that cause small holes in the brain. This prion can replicate itself and spread, causing dementia, ataxia, tremors, and death. Charlotte Riddler, a Master of Science and Director of Philosophy from University College London, mentions that no treatments currently exist for prion diseases in her article written in 2017 published by Nature Reviews Neurology. She describes the disease as causing a misfolding of a protein in the brain that causes other analogous proteins to misfold in the same way. This causes a buildup of misfolded proteins that lead to the disease. Prion diseases can affect a wide range of animals. Baisa Bebalhadi, animal science and veterinary medicine researcher, and his colleagues from the University of Kasadi Marba Orgola declared the discovery of a prion disease that affects camels found in Africa. Prion diseases are versatile and often result in severe negative symptoms and death. How dangerous is chronic wasting disease? There are many studies done on chronic wasting disease that can help us with the assessment of just how dangerous it can be. One of the studies was conducted by Seth Magel and his colleagues from 2003 to 2007. Magel has a PhD from Colorado State University on the effects of animal habitat fragmentation. His study was on 160 white-tailed deer in Wisconsin in their natural habitat where chronic wasting disease was most prevalent. Out of the 160 deer, 4 deer tested positive for chronic wasting disease at the beginning of the study. By the end of the study, all 4 deer had died from the disease, and an additional deer had contracted the disease and also died. Most of the deaths were credited to hunters killing the deer for sport during hunting season. This study shows that there were not many deer infected with the disease during that time, only about 3%. It also shows that the disease was proven to be quite deadly in the rare case that it does infect a deer. This study can be compared to a more up-to-date source on the deer in Wisconsin. According to the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources webpage, there is a particularly infected area in western Wisconsin that has been under surveillance. In 2002, they reported about 8% of males and about 3% of females were infected. In 2018, they reported that about 34% of male deer and about 15% of female deer are now infected. The information in these studies show that chronic wasting disease is becoming more infectious, and it is a deadly disease. Another study done by S. Moore and her colleagues elaborates on the infectivity of the disease. Moore is a postdoctoral research associate that has been working with the United States Department of Agriculture on chronic wasting disease for the past 4 years. Her study was on several different species of cervids, including reindeer, North American caribou, white-tailed deer, mule deer, and elk. They were all exposed to the disease in different ways and across different species. It was found that all species could contract the disease from any other species, and the primary mode of transmission was by exposure to infected saliva, urine, or feces. Her study also suggests that infected prions could travel at least 30 meters in airborne particulate. She concludes that if any cervid is exposed to an area that is contaminated through saliva, urine, feces, or infected decomposing carcasses, they are at risk for infection. This study provides us important information about how the disease is transferred. Any deer that eats from the same foliage or sniffs where another deer has urinated is exposed to chronic wasting disease. If the herd is sharing the same bedding and feeding areas, chronic wasting disease is very likely to spread throughout the herd. According to F. Erlinger from the University of Saskatchewan, the deer antler velvet can also be a contaminant. Antler velvet can realistically transfer the disease because deer generate new antlers every year, and their velvet is shed onto the ground for other animals to sniff or potentially eat. The memorandum published by the Department of Natural Resources in Michigan states that contaminated material can bind to the soil and be taken up by the plants. This will lead to the area being contaminated for years to come. Oswald reports that the disease may also be transferable from dam to fawn or from mother to child, in his article calling for national management of the disease. These studies suggest that chronic wasting disease is capable of spreading quickly and easily to any cervid and often results in the death of the infected organism. There is also research about the possibility of the disease transferring to humans. A study done by Rachel Engers, a principal scientist at University of Kentucky, and her colleagues has proven that chronic wasting disease was transferable to a mouse. The antler velvet of an infected moose was ingested by a slew of mice in her experiment. Some of the mice developed the disease. The researchers go on to say that if a human were to ingest antler velvet, they would be exposed to the prions that cause chronic wasting disease. This study demonstrates that the disease is transferable from a cervid to a species outside of the cervids. Another study on this topic was done by Dr. Baria, a research scientist working at the National CJD Research and Surveillance Unit in the University of Edinburgh. Her study entailed the challenging of a human protein that is also found in cervids. The human protein was exposed to infected material from a North American elk. Several tests were done. It was found that the infected material from the North American elk was capable of converting the human prion protein into the misfolded prion protein that is caused by chronic wasting disease in a couple of the tests. If a human is exposed to infected material, then it is potentially possible for at least one of the prion proteins in the human to be converted into the misfolded prion protein associated with chronic wasting disease. What is the correct response to the increasing prevalence of the disease? Erlinger did extensive research on the best strategies for dealing with chronic wasting disease in 2016. His first strategy that was studied was a non-selective culling of the deer. The researchers determined that this strategy was not effective because the infectivity rate of the disease was independent from the density of infected deer. The disease will still spread at the same rate regardless of the total population of the deer. The second strategy that was studied was selective culling. This strategy was very effective under certain conditions. However, the more deer that become infected, the less effective this strategy becomes. The researchers estimated that in a population of deer where 5% of the deer were infected, using a realistic test and cull strategy, it would take 160 years to eliminate the vast majority of infected deer. Unfortunately, many of the simulations using selective culling where more than 5% of the deer population were already infected resulted in the extinction of the species. In the few cases where the species survived, it was because the disease had killed all of the infected population before it could be transmitted to the few remaining deer that were not infected. Another simulation was run where only male deer were culled, seeing as they're nearly twice as likely to have the disease as female deer. This reduced the rate of infection by 5% by the year 2060. Selective culling is a good strategy if the initial population of deer is below 5% in the region. Another type of selective culling was also studied. This type of selective culling entailed concentrating the culling during the summer where more of the social interaction happens between the deer. However, this method was determined to be costlier and too difficult. The deer would be much harder to manage as they move much farther in the summer. Culling in the summer was also suspected to increase transmission in deer through social interaction. The last strategy that was studied was vaccination. This strategy was determined to be effective if the whole population received the vaccination at the same time. Unfortunately, developing and administering a vaccination to most of the population should prove to be quite difficult. Uhlinger's strategies are mostly simulated, theoretical, but professionally tested methods. His strategies put forth an attempt to quell the disease as soon as possible. In 2003, Opsahl reviewed strategies to prevent the spread of the disease. Opsahl pointed out that the best way of easily preventing the spread of the disease is to put laws in place that ban the import of all cervids into states not infected with chronic wasting disease. He also points out that the exportation of any cervids from infected zones should also be banned. These two simple proposals for regulations on cervid movement can easily be implemented and help slow down the spread of the disease. Opsahl goes on to propose that all states begin surveying cervids by three methods. Firstly, targeted surveillance, a method in which areas where cervids are displaying signs of chronic wasting disease are tested for chronic wasting disease and documented as infected. Secondly, hunter-harvest surveillance, where cervids harvested during hunting season are tested for the disease and results documented. Thirdly, outbreak surveillance, where a group of specimens are acquired from their natural habitat in the wild in order to estimate the rate of infection and the extent of the infected area. The purpose of surveying is to gather information about what herds are infected. This information should primarily be used to keep uninfected herds safe from the disease. Opsahl goes on to explain other methods like putting strict baiting and feeding laws into place. Baiting and feeding cervids brings many of them into a concentrated area where they are much more likely to contract the disease from other cervids. He goes on to say that some states have even placed complex laws on the transportation of venison between and within states. Opsahl continues to explain several cases where non-selective culling was implemented as a possible solution. However, 13 years later, this method was determined to be ineffective by Uhlinger and his researchers. Opsahl admits that the effects of non-selective culling are only hypothesized to be effective. Opsahl adds that fundraising of chronic wasting disease management programs, research programs, and a specialized chronic wasting disease task force would be an effective step forward in combating the disease. Opsahl's research is all based on active discussion and existing management programs during 2003. Is the disease being addressed properly by North America? Just recently, a memorandum to the Natural Resources Commission regarding chronic wasting disease regulations was reviewed and passed into law on August 9th of 2018 by Michigan. The memorandum entailed many changes and regulations in response to chronic wasting disease becoming more prevalent in Michigan. The changes made in the memorandum are made to reduce the rate of infection via commonly infected materials and quell the disease as much as possible. The memorandum also notes other regions that have similar regulations to the ones being proposed for Michigan. This document also identified the first free-ranging white-tailed deer infected with the disease in Michigan as being confirmed on May 20th of 2015. The memorandum also confirms that less than 1% of deer in Michigan are infected with the disease. The first restriction is the ban on unapproved urine-based lures and attractants. All urine-based lures and attractants must comply with the official Archery Trade Association regulations for the urine to be used legally. According to the memorandum, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, Pennsylvania, Vermont, and Virginia have some degree of ban or regulation on urine-based lures and attractants. This type of ban should be effective, as the study done by Moore indicated that urine was one of the main ways cervids contracted the disease. Reducing the amount of dispersed urine, attractants, and lures created by humans should reduce the possibility of exposure to the disease. It is important to note that Wisconsin is not listed here, and Wisconsin is the state where chronic wasting disease is most prevalent in North America. Colorado is also not listed, and this is the state where chronic wasting disease first cropped up in 1960 according to Bailey. And Indiana is also not listed, even though it is located near regions in danger for the spread of chronic wasting disease. The memorandum's second regulation is the baiting and feeding ban in the lower peninsula of Michigan. This action was determined to be a successful management strategy by researcher Upsall in his article about the best actions to take in response to chronic wasting disease. As stated in the memorandum, despite baiting and feeding presenting economic value through agricultural product consumption, the ban will still be employed in Michigan. These states and provinces are listed as having some sort of regulation on baiting and feeding. Alberta, Arkansas, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Maryland, Missouri, Mississippi, New York, North Dakota, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. This ban should prove to be very effective, as it will reduce the congregation of deer. This will result in fewer deer being exposed to the contaminated areas due to urine and excrement that is bound to accumulate in the feeding zones. It will also reduce the number of deer that eat from the same plants or crops, reducing their exposure to saliva from other deer. Again, urine, excrement, and saliva have been tested as carrying the disease by Moore. The contaminants are also suggested to be able to travel airborne for at least 30 meters by Moore. Less congregation of deer in small space should reduce the transfer of the disease. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan is exempt from the ban for now, despite having reported chronic wasting disease cases and sharing a border with Wisconsin. Colorado is also not on the list for the baiting and feeding ban, despite having a prevalence of chronic wasting disease cases. Indiana is also not found on the list, even though it does share the southwestern border of Michigan. The southwestern border of Michigan being the most prevalent area for chronic wasting disease cases in Michigan. It is worth mentioning that the memorandum boasts having a survey of how many hunters support the baiting and feeding ban. 71% of Michigan hunters say that they are okay with the ban if the health of the deer herd is in jeopardy. The memorandum also implements an exception exclusive to Michigan that allows disabled hunters to bait so long as they are not in one of the 13 counties that is flagged for chronic wasting disease management zone. Allowing baiting for some hunters defeats the purpose of the ban to some degree, especially when considering that a lot more deer may be congregated around the bait pile because there are no other bait piles nearby. The memorandum goes on to acknowledge that this exception will not help manage the chronic wasting disease. These two major changes proposed in the memorandum should reduce the exposure of the deer to infected materials. Next, there are some regulations and proposals implemented in the memorandum that fall in line with the somewhat controversial strategies of Ullinger proposed in his article for the best response to increasing prevalence of chronic wasting disease. These strategies entail the culling of cervids. The memorandum introduces a reduced cost antlerless license that is available earlier in the season for private property in the 13 chronic wasting disease management zones. The memorandum also introduces an early season firearm opportunity on private property in the chronic wasting disease management zones. This license regulation will entice hunters to hunt more female deer earlier. It will allow them to use high-powered rifles earlier in the season for harvesting of the antlerless deer. This strategy of culling is somewhat ironic as the culling will be only female deer. As studied by Ullinger, female deer are less likely to have chronic wasting disease than male deer. Culling of male deer is more effective in managing chronic wasting disease. Despite the culling being targeted at what seems to be the wrong sex, the culling is being targeted at chronic wasting disease management zones. The probability of culling a deer that is infected with chronic wasting disease will be the highest in these zones. But it's worth noting that reducing the overall female population will theoretically increase the ratio of infected deer, since culling female deer has a higher probability of eliminating a non-infected deer than culling male deer. Since the population density is independent from infection rate, this strategy of culling female deer can potentially increase the rate of infection. Overall, this new specialized license and early firearm opportunity seems to be relatively poorly designed, or at least not necessary. The memorandum also allots for the use of high-power firearms in late muzzleloader season in the chronic wasting disease management zones. Another regulation introduces an additional late season hunt in the chronic wasting disease management zones. These regulations will allow for more time for deer to be hunted in the danger zones. This is a form of chronic wasting disease targeted culling that is researched by Ullinger and simulated to successfully reduce infection rate of chronic wasting disease in populations with less than 5% of the deer already infected. Since the population of deer infected with chronic wasting disease in these zones is less than 1%, this method should be effective at reducing chronic wasting disease infection rate in Michigan. But it is important to note that only confirmed infected deer were culled in Ullinger's simulations. The memorandum also imposes strict regulations on the transportation of deer carcasses. Regulating contaminated deer carcasses is important as their ability to carry the disease was confirmed by Moore. The following states and provinces have also put restrictions on the transportation of deer carcasses: Alberta, Colorado, Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, New Mexico, New York, Saskatchewan, Utah, Virginia, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. The memorandum includes several other regulations that have been modified or reinstated. This declaration by the Department of Natural Resources in Michigan does make a step forward in the management of chronic wasting disease. It should reduce the transmission of the disease sufficiently in Michigan for now. These regulations must always be kept up to date. The Upper Peninsula of Michigan will need to be included in the baiting and feeding laws soon. The memorandum also brings into question some states that have not implemented any regulations. Colorado rarely participates in chronic wasting disease prevention, and Indiana seems to have not participated at all. Wisconsin Michigan, Virginia, West Virginia, and Illinois are all participating in chronic wasting disease prevention in some way, but Indiana and Ohio, states very close by with reports of chronic wasting disease, are not participating. Conclusion. Chronic wasting disease does not affect very many disease and deer species in North America right now, but it is very prevalent in Wisconsin and is spreading fast and killing the infected. The disease is moderately hard to survey and difficult to manage, but most of North America is taking steps to quell and prevent the spread of the disease, but not all regions of North America are actively updating their chronic wasting disease management systems with their neighbors. Continent-wide unified cooperation that is up to date with surveillance and management systems is required to ensure the disease does not spread uncontrollably and result in many deer species deaths.